Welcome, beloveds, to Nurture the Soul. I am your host today, the Reverend Ellie Hutchison, and I am Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team, and we are a part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. I use they, them pronouns and have a blonde pixie haircut. I am wearing a gold-rimmed glasses and a black and white patterned blouse with black and white earrings today. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar series that provides our local churches and faith practitioners with multitudes of practical, educational, innovative, and formational resources in which to engage with the topics that are facing our communities right now. This webinar centers curiosity and care towards the collective liberation for all of God's creation. We feature guest theologians, preachers, authors, community members, cultural artists, and thought leaders to delve deeply into the topics that help us live into a gospel that is alive at this time. And beloveds, we hope that this virtual space is a space for connection that cultivates a curious and loving community, because we believe that these are two factors that are key in the journey alongside our still speaking God. We invite you every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our regular Nurture the Soul series, and from time to time, we'll have special offerings. You can find a full list for our upcoming programs at ucc.org/event or tune in to any of our social media platforms. You can view the complete list of Nurture the Soul on YouTube at the link that will be placed into chat. And if you are interested in participating or have an idea or a topic that you'd like to learn more about, please feel free to reach out to me via the email address that was used to remind you of today's webinar. And if these conversations move you, friends, if what's offered here helps to enhance your ministry or even you find your soul being nourished, we hope that you consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting the letters UCC to the numbers 41444. These small tokens have huge impacts in helping us to resource you and your community in innovative and engaging ways. We want to thank you for supporting us, but I truly want to thank you for being with us in this virtual space today, or even if you're rewatching this or you're sharing it, or it's been shared with you by a friend, we welcome you to this space. But before I introduce this week's guest, I'd like to remind you to use the chat feature and tell us where it is that you're zooming in from. Continue the conversation amongst each other throughout. And you can find that chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We also invite you to use the Q&A feature. We'll have a small time today at the end after our presenters present a little bit more to ask your question. And again, that Q&A feature is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Both icons are a dialogue bubble. The Q&A feature has a question mark in the middle, and the chat feature has 3 dots, otherwise known as an ellipses, in the middle. And now, beloveds, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be in conversation with 3 amazing humans for the next 3 weeks. Moderating our conversation today so I can sit back and be a viewer just like you all is the Dr. Julia M. Steller, who is a professor emerita in American Religion, History, and Culture at Chicago Theological Seminary. And joining her are the Reverend Dr. Henry Simmons, who was ordained by the UCC in 1974, the best year that there was, if I may say. It was the year I was born. And he has served local churches in Washington, D.C. and Detroit before being elected Secretary for Ethnic and Minority Church Development with the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries. And we are also joined by the Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk, who is currently a member of the Board of Trustees of the Franklinton Center at Bricks, She's a former executive at the Community Renewal Society in Chicago. She's the first Black woman to be ordained by the United Church of Christ and has served this denomination in leadership positions, including serving as its director of Office for Church and Society. And so I invite, yes, all of the hearts. I see all of the hearts on the screen. Henry, Julia, and Mother Delk, please join us on screen, please. I just am so excited to be in conversation with you all. And I know I've been warned not to say this, but I try to follow Mother Delk around often, and I tap her on the shoulder and I'm like, hey, answer my email. So I'm glad that you finally answered it. And Henry, what a gift it is to have gotten to know you over the last several months. Thank you, all three of you, for saying yes to that. And so now I get to sit back and learn just like the rest of our viewers. And Julia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Of the Afro-Christian Convention as the fifth stream of the United Church of Christ is an important part of American religious history. During the 19th century, when a number of Black churches separated from white denominations, Afro-Christians chose to remain because of the faith they had in the core principles of the Christian church movement. In spite of those principles, however, they still met great resistance because of the complicated realities of being Black in a majority white denomination. Even in 1957, with the birth of the United Church of Christ as a united and uniting church, their presence and story remained unacknowledged. But through it all, there was a powerful resource that nurtured their souls and strengthened their work. And that source was the Spirit of Ubuntu. During this series, elders who bear the mantle of the Afro-Christian Convention will look back and recall the strength and determination that nurtured their souls and sustained them in the struggle for justice. It's important that these powerful testimonies be received as more than moments in Black history. Instead, we hope that the conversations will be a call to resist the unthinkable decrees of injustice, exclusion, and hatred that we see today. We also pray that the wisdom shared will inspire us to rethink and reclaim our prophetic witness as we respond to the call for justice and move courageously into action. Each webinar will focus on one value that emerges from the Spirit of Ubuntu. Today, that focus will be dignity, and we're defining dignity as the universal right of all to receive honor, respect, and personhood. So let's begin with our elders. There's a question I'm dying to ask them, and I'll start right now. As elders with your feet firmly rooted in the soil of the Afro-Christian Convention, share a bit about how and where you entered the story and the way that it shaped your life and your ministry. Can we start with Mother Delk?
I am delighted to be here on this occasion. I am celebrating my 85th year, almost my 86th year of life. And when I think about the journey, when I think about all that has been poured into me, over me, around me, and through me, I am delighted to give a testimony. Now, in the Afro-Christian tradition, you had to have a testimony. You have to say what God had done for you. You had to say with all of the mothers and fathers that were around you, how you, in fact, were raised and what it meant for you to celebrate your life, a life that had been given to God. And so in the midst of everything that we're going through in the world that we're facing now, and one of my ways of introducing myself sometimes to others or close friends, I would always ask the question, is it well with your soul? Is it well with your soul? Your soul is that innermost part of your being. It is that which holds you, your mind, your body, your spirit together. And I would ask, is it well with your soul? Well, I grew up in a tradition that continued to enable me to take a question, is it well with your soul, and turn it into an affirmation. It is well with my soul. And trials and tribulations is well with my soul. Going over the valleys and mountains is well with my soul. In the midst of the powers and principalities of racism, it's well with my soul. In the midst of sexism and patriarchy, it's well with my soul. In the midst of growing up in the red light district of Norfolk, Virginia, I was born in 1939 when Jim Crow was rolling and separate was in fact the way of life. I mean, segregation was the way of life, separating the races. And as I grew up, all around me were the signs that would always affirm to me that I was not of equal value to those who were white in Norfolk, Virginia. Well, how could it be that it could be well with your soul? Well, it was well with my soul, and I'm going to tell you why. It was well because I had around me, surrounding me, a wonderful community of faith and family, enabling me to be able to stand strong with courage in the midst of everything that was going on in the world and in my life. That I had to be able to wake up in the morning feeling that I had value. I had to wake up in the morning feeling that I had worth and dignity. And that was poured into me by my family. My mother and father and my 7 siblings, we were growing up in the red light district of Norfolk, Virginia. And when my mother was pregnant with me in 1939, she joined Macedonia Afro-Christian Church. And it was important for her to go there because she had lost a child before me. And my mother was so desperate not to lose me that, in fact, she didn't even want to go across town to the Baptist church. She decided she'd go right across the street almost to Macedonia. That was my entrance into Macedonia Afro-Christian Church. And she entered with a spirit that was there that I would call Ubuntu. The folk who were there was a circle of life and support for her. They connected to my mother, who really was struggling at that time, hoping to God that she would not lose this baby. And so at Macedonia, the Ubuntu spirit of respect surrounded my mother. My mother was able in prayer meetings and in church to feel their support all around her. And her prayer the whole time she was carrying me was that I would live, and that God would let me live in the world of which we were a part. That Lord would let me live in the midst of racism and sexism and all of the things. God let her live. Ubuntu is a sense of being one with the other, connecting one to the other, sharing at the deepest level of pain and at joy as well. Well, that's what Macedonia Afro-Christian Church was for my mother and then for all of us. It was a safe place. It was an affirming place. It was a place that poured into our hearts and minds and bodies that we were sons and daughters of God. And as sons and daughters of God, we could be whatever we chose to be at whatever we put our minds and hearts together. It was wonderful growing up at Macedonia. I grew up there knowing that that whole church was vested in me, invested in my becoming the child that I needed to be, a child that would feel love and feel affirmation and would understand the gifts that she had. I started in the beginning thinking that maybe I didn't have a whole lot of gifts, but in Macedonia, all I had to do was get up and say my recitation and the whole congregation would in fact applaud. I thought, all right, I've done something really wonderful here. They made me feel affirmed. They made me feel that my gifts, that are gifts from God. And each and every Sunday when we were there, I was surrounded by that faith. I was surrounded by that family. I was surrounded by the spirit that continue to affirm me as a daughter of God. Macedonia was not only a safe space, it was equipping space. It was not only equipping space, but it was also the place where we lived in relationship to each other. I knew I had more than my mother as my mother. At Macedonia, every one of the mothers of the church, or the women of the church, could look to me. And if they looked of me not being in my right way in church, that meant I had my attention someplace else. I knew it was time for me to straighten up. But they were vested in my being the very best that I could be. And so the Afro-Christian tradition, in the midst of a narrative, a negative narrative, was a narrative of hope. It was a narrative that, in fact, allowed us to Sunday by Sunday and through the week live a different narrative, a narrative where we were affirmed, a narrative where we could, in fact, affirm each other. And it was at Macedonia, at 10 years of age, that I decided I wanted to walk the aisle. And I did. I walked the aisle of Macedonia, gave my hand to Reverend Hosea Scott, and I gave my heart to Jesus Christ. I was baptized in the water. I was baptized. But when I went down in the water and came back up, I knew then I was a part of a much broader community, a much larger community, a community that was living for a different narrative than the narrative that was in the world that was surrounding me at that particular moment in time. But not only were they vested in me being the best that I could and surrounding me with affirmation and nurture and encouragement each and every day, they also wanted me to be able to equip myself for how I would live. And so everything I was going through, all of the Sunday school lessons, was to empower me to stand strong in the world that I was a part of. In Vacation Bible School, we were learning about God, no question, but it was also empowering me to resist the powers of evil, to resist the powers that can, in fact, make you feel like you are less than. And so Macedonia, a part of the Afro-Christian tradition, was a place of resistance and resilience in the midst of injustice. And I was being empowered with gifts that I would have to do that, to figure out a way how not to become a part of the problem, but to be able to resist in every way that I could. And then the Afro-Christian tradition also had a wonderful place called Franklin Center at Briggs. It was also the extended community in my life. And it was another place where, in fact, my faith and my family would surround me in a way that it would empower me for the call on my life. You got to have those places that see the strengths in you, that see the gifts in you, that see the affirmations in you. And Franklin Center was that for me. Every summer, I would be able to go to Franklin Center from the time I was 10 years old up until I graduated from high school. And it too was a place that nurtured me in the faith, but surrounded me with the Ubuntu understanding of dignity and worth and affirmation. They saw stuff in me that I didn't even see in myself. When I say I am so grateful to be on this earth in my 85th year, almost my 86th year of life, is because there were so many who poured into me their affirmation, poured into me their sense of belief of what I could do and where I could move in life. My faith and my family became empowering places for me. And it was on the campus of Franklin Center that I began to receive my call into ministry. It was there through persons like Purcell Austin, persons like a Mrs. King, persons like Mrs. Judson, who was I'm trying to think of Judson's last name. Well, forgive me, because sometimes the gray hair means my memory goes at moments of this. But they were women and men who surrounded us, and they saw something in me that was wonderfully affirmed and began to make me reach into my spirit to see, in fact, that and to claim it as well. So my testimony about that Afro-Christian tradition, I was connected to it from the time that I was in my mother's womb. I grew up in it from the time I was at Macedonia Afro-Christian Church that continued to surround me and empower me. It was a part of my life's journey when I was on the campus of Franklin Center, where they began to, in fact, enable me to look at the call of God on my life and what I would do. It was my soul-saving station. It was my life-giving station. And because of that, I've been able to live for 80-some years of life rooted in a foundation of hope, rooted in a foundation that says, in fact, that we live not just for ourselves, but for one another, rooted in the ability to stand the storms that would be coming day by day by day. Franklin Center was a life-giving space. It was, in fact, that nurtured me for the long haul. I am so grateful that I had roots in family, roots in faith, and roots that would allow me to stand against the storms of life. One of my favorite hymns is God has been so good to me. Great is your faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. The faith that there is another narrative, the faith of those surrounding me, enabling me to be able to live into that as boldly as I could, because there was another narrative that never intended for me to survive, but I did. And I've survived with strong roots. When you have strong roots, you can find a way to stand against the winds of injustice in life. Franklin Center, the Afro-Christian Convention, New Macedonia, of men and women of faith who enable me. I am because they are. And because they are, at this stage in my life, I got more fire inside of me than I ever had before to keep on running this race. Yes, it is well with my soul.
Thank you, Mother Delk. I have to say something. If it wasn't well with my soul at the beginning of this webinar, it is clearly well with my soul. Thank you so much for that testimony that really focused in on the importance of that feeling of self in community that you received at Macedonia. And it wasn't simply about your identity, it was about preparing you for the fight.
Yeah.
Giving you a sense of resilience
Yeah.
to kind of counteract that Jim Crow reality that you were born into. Thank you so much for that testimony. Thank you so much. Well, now, Reverend Simmons, give us a word or two about your journey and how you entered the Afro-Christian story.
First of all, let me say how much of a pleasure it is for me to share in this webinar with such distinguished persons on such an important set of considerations in this very, very particular and peculiar time, not only in the life of our church, but of our nation and our world. Secondly, I'm tempted to simply say, let the church say amen, and let us collect the offering and see if we can get some folk who want to join this great movement. I have always been appreciative, as Mother Delk, of persons who have poured into my life that which enables me to keep hope alive and to keep on keeping on. And one of those persons, of course, is Mother Delk. Like Mother Delk, I was born in the belly of the beast of the Jim Crow South. Just a few years after her birth, but born in a place and at a time when one had to make up one's mind and one's heart that one was in fact and is in fact somebody. And I found that much like Mother Delk, that sense of encouragement, that sense of affirmation, largely through the church. Now, I was born into the Congregational Christian Church, Washington Terrace Congregational Christian Church, but that church is located and was located in the heart of the Afro-Christian Convention area, namely back then in the Convention of the South, and now that is part of the Southern Conference. I was born into the Washington Terrace Congregational Christian Church by grace. And by grace, I mean by my mother. Now, I wasn't in the womb like Mother Yvonne, but I was barely out of the womb when we became part of that church. That was in a day when, of course, there was no choice, but you had to go to church. There was no debate, no conversation in my household. And it was interesting because my father was a lifelong Baptist. And he was a Baptist born, a Baptist bred, and when he died, he was a Baptist dead. But my mother and all of my 6 siblings, all of whom were young men, were members of the Congregational Christian Church. The impact of that is almost beyond the ability to fully describe. 3 people, in addition to my mother, but 3 people helped to shape me and passed on to me and introduced to me and immersed me in the Afro-Christian tradition. The first was the Reverend Dr. Joseph Taylor Stanley, who was the Convention of the South superintendent. Dr. Stanley, of course, was pretty much out of the congregational side of the church. The second person was his spouse, Mrs. Catherine Turrentine Stanley, who was what would today would be the equivalent of a commissioned Christian education worker. Mrs. Stanley took charge of everything. Amen. She was a strong Black woman. And let me give you a little demographics about Washington Terrace Congregational Church, Christian Church. It never had any more than 85 members. We never had a full-time minister, and no more than 5 of the members at any time were over the age of 21. We were a youth church, but a church that was viewed as a nurturing ground, a place where you were to strive for excellence, where you were looked at as a somebody, where you were affirmed as precious in God's sight and each other's sight. And I'll talk about that a little later. The third person, and this is the Afro-Christian Convention connection, was Reverend Dr. Purcell O. Alston. Dr. Alston would come and preach, come and help us from time to time. And it was Purcell Alston through the Convention of the South that, like Mother Delk, I was introduced to Franklinton Center at Bricks. My first visit to that sacred space was in the summer of 1961. And those who know anything about American history know that the summer of 61 was the summer of the Freedom Riders. And there was a spirit there at Franklinton Center that resonated with the then pretty active and beginning to evolve even more strongly civil rights movement. And I can recall the being at Franklinton Center, where our camp songs were not simply the run-of-the-mill camp songs, but we sang the songs of the freedom movement. And Purcell would get up with his baritone voice and lead all of us campers in uh, those songs. Ain't nobody gonna turn me around. That was one of the songs. Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. As a 12-year-old, that had tremendous impact on me. Not only as I sought to do my best within the church to be a good follower of Christ, but as I sought to navigate through all of the obstacles of being a young African American male in segregated South, where everything around me said that I didn't count, that those like me didn't matter. One of the earliest memories of my life was at the age of 4 years old, being pulled away from a water fountain outside of a five and dime store in High Point, North Carolina. And I was pulled away from that water fountain because I got tired of standing in line behind all of my brothers and so forth. And I said, I'll go over here and get a drink. Well, I didn't know how to read at 4. Some would think that I would not be able to read at age 40. But that water fountain said white only. And I was pulled away by an older cousin who lived in New York. And he never explained to me why. He simply said to my father, he just didn't know any better. With those kind of experiences, one needs a community of people, of special places in order to enable one to move ahead. And that's what Purcell Austin and Dr. J.T. Stanley and Mrs. Catherine Turrentine Stanley, and above all, Purcell Austin did for me. I received my call to ministry at Franklinton Center at Bricks at the age of 15, but it took me several years to realize that the Lord had actually called me and that I was to respond in the affirmative. So I am in the Afro-Christian church, and the Afro-Christian church is in me because of the people who had their rootedness in that great convention, who operated, ran pretty much, founded Franklinton Center at Bricks, and who continued to encourage me to be more than my environment or my world said that I could be. I praise God that the Afro-Christian Church practiced the spirit of Ubuntu. It said that we cannot make it as a despised and long denied and disallowed people, except that we acknowledge our somebodyness and our preciousness in God's sight and each other's sight together. That's my little testimony, and I'm proud of it.
Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting as I listen to your testimony and Mother Delk's testimony. It's so interesting how the spirit of Ubuntu just found its way from the founders at the very beginning in 1892, straight on through the 1960s. And in each of those movements, it continued to nurture souls. But more than nurturing souls, it placed a fire within each of you, within each of all the people that were involved in that, to resist, to move forward, and to ask the hard questions that needed to be asked to move us toward justice in the church and in this nation. You know, the name Afro-Christian is really an important name. And one would say that there's power in the ability to name one's reality. And the Afro-Christians really knew that. So I'd like Mother Delk to say a little bit about the importance of that name and how it served as a source of dignity and empowerment for the Afro-Christian forebears and those that came beyond that. The importance of a name. Say a little bit about that, Mother Delk.
Yes, when you are growing up in a narrative that, in fact, is a narrative that is meant to demean you, dismiss you, devalue you, they do it in ways in which they name you names. And the names carry with them the ability to be able to reduce you to being less than who you are. There's an African proverb that says, it does not matter what they call you. It is what you answer to that's important. Macedonia, the Afro-Christian Convention, allowed honor, allowed dignity, allowed affirmation, so that my daddy, who dug graves for a living, and for many, they would feel that was not, in fact, an honor to have to dig graves, but that my father was willing to do whatever he could to put food on our table, to enable my mother to stay home and be there for all of us, and to come home at night and be able to celebrate with us. For me, he was wonderful in my estimation. However, he was around a society, though, that continued to label him as boy, label him in ways that they would never, in fact, call him by a title like Mr. But on Sunday morning, when my father put on his suit, we used to call it the Sunday go-to-meeting suit, and when he stepped into Macedonia, he was digging Delk. When he was greeted by the congregation, because Daddy was not only digging Delk, he was chairman of the digging board. In that place, they bestowed honor and dignity. And to be able to stand in the honor of being a deacon at Macedonia Afro-Christian Church carried with it honor, carried with it a whole sense of self-worth. The funny tale is, my father never gave up the position of being chairperson of the deacon board until he died. As a matter of fact, when they were ready to vote in new members to the deacons, my father would all say, all positions are available except the chairperson of the deacon board. That was Daddy's, and they made him, in fact, emeritus, deacon emeritus. But names matter. How we live into our names matter. Our feeling of self-worth matters. And so for me, it was so important. When in 1979, I was at National Staff then, I received the word from Avery Post that I would be honored with the Antoinette Brown Award. I was delighted, but I knew that it would mean nothing to me if my mother and father could not be there with me, standing in the midst of that congregation. I wanted them to know I didn't get here by myself. I got here because of Mother, who prayed for me night and day. and continue to pray for all her children as long as they live. I got here because of a father who was willing to do whatever in order that I could have the best education, in order that I could achieve the path that God had for me. And so I brought my mother and father to Indianapolis to that Senate. Well, I can't remember if it was in Indianapolis or not, but whatever Senate it was. And when it was time for me to receive the Antoinette Brown Award, I walked up with my mother and my father, and I introduced them to the Senate. Now, this is a predominantly white Senate that is in existence here. And at that time that I was on the national staff, I had had some real issues with the pension board, and especially with the head of the pension board at that time, because we were debating whether we should take all our resources out of South Africa and out of supporting apartheid. And the head of the pension board was saying, but we are building resources for our pastors in their elderly age, in a time in which they will need resources. And so for us, it was trying to protect and to be able to honor our clergy when they are in their senior years. And we have been fighting. And we said, nevertheless, there's got to be other ways to do it. And he and I were at odds, really at odds. And so at that Senate, when we were honored, he was there. He was there. And we went up on the stage, and I stood there with my mother and my father, and I indicated in the Ubuntu understanding, there's no way I could have been here had it not been for them. And so for me, the honor is not for me alone, but it's the honor for them. My father, Deacon Marcus Delk, and my mother, Mrs. Cora Delk. I honor them just as I am honored. I give God the thanks for them just as I am honored. And so it was a moment, and folks stood up and they began to applaud as they affirmed that moment as I stood with my mother and father. I have their pictures on my wall right now with Avery Post, and they are standing there looking so proud. We come down off of the stage, and the first person who comes to me is the head of the pension board. He embraces me, and he embraces my mother and my father. And he said to me at a later moment, I never said to my parents what I wished I could have said. But when you were there with them, I lived through that moment with you. Standing in dignity, standing in affirmation, standing in recognition of who we are as human beings, connects. And it connected to him. No longer were we debating each other about the pension boards, although I definitely believe we had to come out of South Africa. We were, in fact, connected on a human level in a moment of naming what it means to honor those who are, in fact, with you. Ubuntu means honor. It means affirming the reality of that which, in fact, makes us human in the midst of the realities of death. To remain human in the midst of the realities of death is unbelievably important. Have a title that is the title of honor, means everything. You know, I call myself now Mother Yvonne Virginia Delk. It is no longer Reverend Doctor. And I want you to know that in the early stage, it was very important. I earned my Reverend, I earned my doctor's degree, and I especially didn't want those men disrespecting that. And they had a way of not being willing to call you by title, Reverend Doctor. They would call you Sister Yvonne. That meant they weren't ready to acknowledge your being female and being, in fact, ordained in the midst of the moments that we have. And we have ways of dishonoring and disrespecting. And I was determined that they would respect me. I was determined that I would not answer unless they gave me the Reverend Doctor in the context of the naming. However, as I moved through life, it wasn't so important to me to be named as a way of setting me apart from, but to have a name that connected me directly in the heart. I didn't need power and privilege so much as I needed to be in relationship. And so it was in the time that I was leaving the Community Renewal Society in Chicago. It was the late 90s, almost going into the year 2000. And it was going to be a shift for me because I had struggled through a number of things in the midst of it, sometimes trying to hold the world up. And my body was, in fact, feeling all of the pressure of trying to be so much. Solo, in fact, can in fact wear you down mentally, emotional. It is when we are in relationship. And a number of my friends decided they saw me really going down at that moment, intervened in my situation and basically said, we're not going to watch you die on this job. We are saying to you, it's time for you to have time out. And I needed time out. And so when I left Community Renewal Society, I had time out. And the time out was to come home. And when I came home, I knew I needed my mind, body, soul, and spirit. And I'm thinking again for the feeling of community. I'm so grateful for the sisters who surrounded me, and especially Bernice Powell Jackson that I had been moving with. She saw that I needed to take a step back for healing of my mind, body, soul, and spirit. When we can, in fact, connect to each other that way, it's wonderful. When we can hear each other, and at that moment, I was able to come home in the midst of the reality. And I was able to be ministered to. I was one who had ministered to so many, but now I'm in a position where I need others to mentor to me. And it was okay for me to know that my spirit had taken a hit. It was okay for me to know that I was going to have to, in fact, get myself into a context in which I now was not so much the Reverend Doctor, but that I could be the one that others, in fact, could minister to. And in that moment of coming back home, in that moment of having my mind, my body, and my spirit being renewed, when I came up out of that, I was now in my 60s, and I knew that for me, my name would change. My name would change. I no longer needed to be the Reverend Doctor. I wanted to be Mother Yvonne. Because there were many of us who were struggling at that time, many of us who were in positions at that time. I wanted to see them to see me as a connecting thread, connecting tissue, relating in the midst of pain and struggle, related in the midst of trying to figure out how to move through in the midst of this. And by that time, Bernice and I had given birth to the African American women in ministry, and many women were struggling just to be. And I wanted to be to them mother, not Reverend Doctor. And it became a life-giving place for me. And so for me to live now in the title of mother means everything to me, to share out of that space all that I've gone through, to be, in fact, the storyteller that enables us to, in fact, make it possible to do the things that we need to do, but to give the story that reminds them over and over again that you are not alone on this journey. And so it's been an amazing moment of being able, out of my pain and struggle, trying to be so much as the great I am, and I wasn't the great I am. I was really standing on the shoulders of a whole lot of people, but I was trying my best to be the best that I could. But so much of it had an impact on my body, mind, and spirit. The 90s was a time that we lost a lot of good friends. They were doing wonderful things in the world. They were doing a lot of justice pieces in the world. However, it took a toll on their bodies, their minds, and spirits and relationships. So to be able to have others say to me, time out. And in that time out, I decided that I would, in fact, become, if I could, a life-giving, offering spirit, offering wisdom, offering faith, standing with in the midst of all that we are going to, not as a reverend doctor, but as a mother. And I'm grateful now to be the mother of my church. I'm so grateful to be the mother of Franklinton Center at Briggs. I'm so glad that I'm the mother of TFAM. I am so glad I am in a place, not of power and privilege, but simply standing as mother, affirming, mother to help naming, mother to protect, mother to give witness and spiritual counsel, mother to say, it can be well with your soul, even in the midst of the powers and principalities. I'm so grateful now to be here at this moment in my life as mother, a title that in the context of the Afro-Christian tradition means in relationship with, not over and above, connecting to, not competing with, being with on the journey. And as long as God gives me the courage and the wisdom and the strength, I love now living in relationship to as mother.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mother Delk. I won't go doctor and reverend, I'll go Mother Delk. Thank you so much. You know, that whole idea of standing in dignity and affirmation is a powerful experience. And what you just demonstrated is how Ubuntu actually presents that not simply something for the person, but for the whole community, because it only happened because of the whole idea of community. But there's another thing that I'm hearing underneath that power also ignites a fire of affirmation and strength that explodes in resistance. And as I listen to Reverend Simmons' earlier comments, I'm wondering how that example of resistance inspired by Ubuntu actually exploded and took forms of resistance and even forms of resilience in the 60s during a time when things were really hot and bothered. So say a little bit about how that Ubuntu spirit that empowered dignity and affirmation actually took the next step to resistance in much of your ministry.
Well, in much of my ministry, which in fact came really into being in the 60s and 70s, which, as you have noted, Julia, was a very, very dynamic time, often turbulent time in our nation and for the church, particularly churches that characterize themselves as multiracial and multicultural. The issue of dignity at that time, and with all of those forces that were going on with the civil rights movement and so forth, I think was pretty much summarized by Fannie Lou Hamer's declaration when she was trying to get seated as a delegate in the Mississippi delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Her famous phrase was that she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. The weight of being dealt with as persons who were inconsequential, irrelevant, and sometimes even as irreverent, drove the need to rely on Ubuntu, not just for individual success, but for communal success or communal progress. The 60s did that, as we noted with the Civil Rights Movement, but also with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act, both of which we know today are under tremendous assault. with attempts to not just ignore that, but to erase it. And so that the issue of seeking justice does not come by just waiting for it. It comes by organizing and pushing and drawing together and strategizing for that. The 60s and 70s were also a time where uh, people of African ancestry were called to, as Mother Delk said earlier, to define ourselves, to determine what would be our standards of dignity and excellence. It was at a time where we had the beginning, when you speak of resistance, of the Black power, Black identity movement, which those of us who are blessed to be a part of the Ubuntu spirit know was not an easy thing. It caused a lot of some disruption even amongst Black folk. There was a time when to be called Black was not necessarily a badge of honor. There was a time when we were not encouraged to do that. And that's one of the strengths of the Afro-Christian Convention. The mere retention of the moniker Afro said very clearly who we were and where we would always stand and how we would always relate to one another and to our world. There was also the beginning in the early 70s, late 60s of the Black theology movement, which pressed Black folk and the rest of the church, particularly churches that were predominantly white, to wrestle with the issues of what will be the defining methods by which we view not only ourselves, but our God. How are we a part of God's wonderful, wonderful, not only family, but God's intention for the world? We also note that it was in the 60s and the early 70s that people of African ancestry in the United Church of Christ caught up in that movement to find dignity communally, led by the late Dr. Charles Cobb, who was the executive director of the former Commission for Racial Justice, and others formed the Ministers for Racial and Social Justice to push the church. One of Charlie's favorite sayings was the United Church of Christ has a proclivity to do justice, to do right when it's pushed. And it is that pushing, not to denigrate or to demean others, because we know what that feels like, but to say that we have much to offer, not simply as objects of mission, but also as subjects, as partners in mission. That was what the Franklin Center at Bricks was used for, to equip, to empower persons of all persuasions, but particularly Black folk, to be these living witnesses for justice in the world. Today, we are faced with not only the intent to ignore the singular contributions that people of African ancestry can bring, but attempts to even erase it. Dignity must be protected, it must be sought for, must be fought for, and it is by way of resistance to be denigrated and debased that we arrive at a sense of wholeness in life. The 60s and 70s brought a lot of change to our society, to the church, to our society, and to the world. I mentioned the Black theology movement begun by Dr. James Cone and also Dr. J.D. Otis Roberts at Howard University. Dr. Cone was at Union Divinity School. That made an impact on future leaders in the church, such as myself. But it had already been lived out by the posture, the theology, the 5 principles, the culture, and so forth of the Afro-Christian church. It was almost as if the rest of us were catching up, Mother Yvonne. We were catching up to what our predecessors and our ancestors were rooted in the Afro-Christian convention. And so it was a time for us to resist being mislabeled, to resist being debased, and to name and claim who we are. It is summarized, I think, in an iconic photo taken of the Memphis, Tennessee sanitation workers who were on strike when Dr. King went there to help begin to, move their protest ahead. And in that iconic photo, there are these Black men, most of whom were dressed in suits and ties, not in jeans or so forth, but they're holding placards. And there was a simple message on those placards which said, "I am a man. I am a man." And that was powerful because it didn't say, we want to raise. It didn't say that, we're here because we're here in the fight for dignity, in a fight to be who we are, who we know we are, and to claim what we deserve. And the United Church of Christ at that moment, in those moments, was growing into a sense of, yes, there should be this dignity, this regard for all persons. The important thing to remember, however, is that we in the Afro-Christian tradition in general, but Black folk in particular, never, ever doubted that we were somebody. We couldn't doubt that and be able to survive. So that's what it breeds. Not only resilience, but resistance to anything that would denigrate what God had created in God's image and our rootage far before our ancestors were enslaved and put into chains. Our history begins well before that because Ubuntu is rooted in the midst of African heat.
Clearly our notion of dignity is under direct attack today. And every single thing, every time I turn on the TV, I see dignity in many ways being attacked. And I often wonder what the Afro-Christians' ancestors would say to us at this point. I said earlier that we really need to find ways to recover our prophetic witness, and to respond in justice and not only respond to the call of justice, but to move toward courageous actions that are going to actually move some things. And I wonder, in closing, what insight might you have from your experiences in your churches, from the encouragement you received as in earlier years, but also from things that you've seen and things that you've learned. How is it that we, as a united and uniting church, can begin to reclaim our commitment and rethink our sense of dignity in ways that will be prophetic and transformative, not only in our church, but in the large community for such a time as this? Just closing comments from each of you on how we might begin to rethink that during this crazy time. Mother Delk, can you begin?
I think I'm reminded of when I arrived at my first General Senate in 1969 as the new Director of Christian Education for Urban and Black Church Education. And it was the Senate that I would be introduced to the whole Senate of the United Church of Christ. And Reverend W.H. Thomas, who is one of the fathers of the Afro-Christian tradition, said to me as I was going to fulfill that position, "Don't forget us. Don't forget the struggle. Don't forget who you are and whose you are. There is a purpose for your life, and that purpose is to continue to stand as strong as you can for justice, for wholeness, for freedom in the midst of the trials and tribulations. Don't allow the title of being the first interrupt your ability to be one in a chain of mothers and fathers who have stood strong for freedom, who have stood strong in affirmation of justice in the land, who have stood strong for the beloved community. Don't forget that you are connected to those who have come before you, but you got a role to play for those who will come afterwards. Stand strong in your name. Stand strong in your faith. Stand strong in your commitment to fight each and every day for the journey of wholeness in this land. I could not afford, as somebody just said not too long ago, allow the circle to be unbroken on my watch. It was now my time. And when W.H. Thomas said, "Don't forget," I knew he was saying for me, in the midst of everything that you're going into, in the midst of all that you're about of, you've been called for a purpose. You stand in that purpose. And I think that's what they would say to us. The times in which we now live means that we have been called for just such a time as this, and the fierce urgency of now. Their spirits are all around us, surrounded by so great a cloud of witness. And we have been empowered in our time to stand as boldly as we can. It was with a gratitude for the last General Senate that I was able to bring W.H. Thomas and all the mothers and fathers of the Afro-Christian Convention into the United Church of Christ as one of a stream of living waters that is now considered the fifth stream, flowing with faith, flowing with affirmation of a God that continues to call us to stand in the midst of times just like this and fight for every fiber of our being for the beloved community. I am so grateful that W.H. Thomas is now a living water flowing in. And I hope he feels I didn't fail him on my watch.
Well said, Mother Delk. My answer to the question, Julia, is simply to reference the title of this webinar. my soul looks back and wonders how I got over. This is a webinar as a part of an ongoing series of nurturing the soul. One of the things that we said at the beginning was we don't want this to be purely an intellectual exercise. One cannot stand, one cannot overcome, one cannot endure the fierce urgency of now without nurturing the soul. The strength of the Afro-Christian Convention was its attention to what lies within, to dreams, to hopes, to conviction, that nothing from the outside could sway, nothing from the outside could destroy. And so I would say that when the Afro-Christian Convention folk would gather for worship, that's why worship was so powerful. It was not a way of overlooking the realities of life. It was not escapist religion. It was empowering to go back out and face the hell that they had to face on their way to heaven. This is what we, I think, need today, is to not separate spiritual development from the witness for justice, because they cannot be separated. They are one in the same. So I would hope and pray that we would strengthen our souls, that you would find strength not only from our stories, but from all others around you who have faced the daunting challenge to be persons of dignity in environments that would not dare even try to see their personhood. So look back. Let your soul look back and wonder. No, let it look back and know how you got over.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. The story, never forget, the story of the Afro-Christian Convention is the United Church of Christ story. So the charge is for all of us to remember, to respond, to resist, and restore all that we know we need for such a time as this. This is a crazy time, my brothers and sisters, but it can be done through God's Spirit and through the fire of resistance and resilience.
This has been an amazing conversation. I feel so blessed to be able to sit here. I've been taking notes, the whole time. Lots of things that I would love to be able to ask, but I know we are short on time today, beloveds. What a gift it is to have you, Mother Delk, Reverend Dr. Henry, and Dr. Julia be a part of our community on this online space today, and all of the wisdom and just the words of inspiration, aspiration that you've shared with us today have been amazing. And as long as I've hosted this, it's been a little over a year now where I've been the host of Nurture the Soul. Never have I seen the rain of hearts and applauses that we saw after your comments. And so I want to thank all of those who joined us live for letting our presenters and our elders know how much they are appreciated and loved. And so I want to just thank you all for being with us. If you liked what you heard today, we will follow up with an email either the end of this week or the beginning of next week. And we hope that you invite people to share, or to share it by inviting them to watch it and joining us next week. We're going to be back next Thursday, February 20th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for part 2 of this 3-part series, joined by these amazing humans that are really helping us to better understand how to nurture our souls at such a time as this. And without further ado, Mother Delk, I'd love to turn it back over to you to go ahead and take us out with a benediction. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Julia.
God, we thank you for life. God, we thank you for hope. God, we thank you that your spirit rests, rules, and abide in us. So empower us now to go forth. Go forth in the power of your vision of a beloved community. Go forth in your calling us by name to stand and witness as boldly as we can to the world that you intend. Go forth in dignity. Go forth in knowing that we exist in relationship one to the other. I am because you are. And because you are, I can be also. And together, we can stand in dignity for all in the globe. Stand for justice for all in the world. Our destinies are interconnected. And in the African understanding of Ubuntu, all life is sacred. And so, God, we go forth in the power of testimonies today, but we go forth in the power of your spirit that continues to be in each of us. Let us claim it and let us stand one with the other in the uniting and united Church of Christ for justice, wholeness, and peace. In your name we pray. Amen and amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.